What if the color of your skin determined how you were treated, not just by strangers, but by the very people sworn to protect you? What if a simple mistake could cost you your dignity, your freedom, or even your life? In a world where justice is supposed to be blind, what happens when the very system meant to uphold fairness is infected with bias and prejudice? Michael, a dedicated FBI agent, thought he had left the prejudices of the past behind. But one fateful day in Atlanta, a routine stop turned into a nightmare when Officer George mistook him for a criminal. What followed challenged everything Michael believed about the system, forcing him to confront the harsh reality of racial profiling. Can one man's fight for justice make a difference in a world that often turns a blind eye? Michael's story is just the beginning of a conversation we all need to have. Stay with us as we unravel this gripping tale of mistaken identity, racial injustice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Are you ready to face the truth? Because this story will make you question everything you thought you knew. If you believe in standing up against prejudice, hit the like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love to hear from you. Michael Reed was a man of quiet strength. At 35, he had built a respectable life for himself and his family. Standing at an impressive 6 feet tall, with smooth brown skin and intelligent eyes, Michael had the calm demeanor of someone who knew his worth but saw no need to flaunt it. But he worked hard, pushed past every barrier, and eventually joined the FBI. It was a dream he'd nurtured through late nights and early mornings, knowing that one day he'd make a difference. But outside his career, he was a husband and father first. He was off duty today, dressed in jeans and a dark shirt, looking like any regular guy. But behind that casual appearance was a man who had put his life on the line to bring criminals to justice. But tonight was different. The familiar hum of the grocery store late at night was a rare comfort for Michael. A brief escape from the complexities of his job and the pressures of being a black man in America. As he collected his items, the store's bright fluorescent lights reflected off his glasses, making him appear more serious than he felt. As Michael stepped out of the groceries store, Officer George Turner gazed at him from the position he was standing. George Turner was a 15-year veteran of the force. Years of patrolling the city had hardened him, dulled his empathy, and sharpened his biases. He believed he was just doing his job, keeping the city safe. But he'd long since stopped questioning his instincts, trusting them implicitly, even if they sometimes led him down the wrong path. The sight of Michael near an upscale district set off George's internal alarms. His mind filled in the blanks, leading him to assume Michael was out of place. George approached, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his voice rough from years of barking commands. Michael stopped and turned, surprised to see the officer. His heart rate picked up, but he kept his face calm. "Can I help you, officer?" "Yes, seems you are new over here, because I have not seen you around here before. Please can I see some ID?" George asked, his tone carrying an underlying assumption of guilt. Michael frowned, his body tensing slightly. "Is there a problem?" "Just a routine check," George replied, his eyes narrowing. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area." Michael's mind raced. He had seen this kind of thing before. Stories on the news, incidents with friends, racial profiling. But he was a FBI agent. Surely, this would clear itself up once the officer knew who he was. He checked his pocket but could not find his ID, so he told the officer that he is not with his ID, he must have left it at home, but he introduced himself as a FBI agent. George did not believe what he said, his skepticism growing. He didn't care about his profile. All he saw was a black man, out late at night, in a neighborhood that wasn't his. "Sir, I want you to turn around slowly and just show me your hands at your back where I can see them," George ordered. "There have been suspicious activities over here lately, and I will have to detain you since you cannot provide a means of identification." As Michael obeyed and turned around, and George quickly handcuffed his wrists. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Michael said, his voice firm but controlled. "I haven't done anything wrong." George ignored him, his own frustration building. Frustration began to seep into Michael's usually composed demeanor. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze, their whispered judgments pressing down on him. It was infuriating, humiliating, and yet he tried to stay calm. But George wasn't budging. Michael glanced around, hoping someone might step in, say something. But the crowd was silent, faces blank, expressions tinged with voyeuristic curiosity. No one saw him as Michael Reed, a federal agent. They saw him as just another black man in cuffs. At last, Michael tried a different approach. "Fine, you're not going to listen to me? Then call my supervisor at the bureau." George's eyes narrowed, and he scoffed. "Look, buddy, the only place you're going is downtown." Michael's patience was wearing thin. Standing in the middle of the street, the cuffs biting into his wrists, he took a deep breath. He wasn't a man prone to anger, but the sheer injustice of it all was beginning to get to him. "I told you," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Call the FBI. Check my credentials. You'll see I'm telling the truth." Officer George, however, wasn't listening. His eyes were narrowed, focusing on the man he had just apprehended, as though Michael's words were little more than noise. "Standard procedure," George muttered, tapping away at his radio. Michael tried again, more urgently this time. "Listen to me, officer. I'm with the FBI. I am off duty and my badge is at home. Call the bureau. They'll verify who I am." But George wasn't interested. He was already making assumptions, wrapped up in his own prejudice. The whispers of doubt, the stories of suspicious figures, those had clouded his judgment long before he even stepped out of his patrol car. "No need for that," George finally said, his voice sharp, dismissive. "There's been a call from an anonymous source, saying they saw a black man, looking suspicious, walking around the neighborhood last week, just like the one that attempted a robbery here. You match the description." Michael's heart sank. The officer wasn't even going to check. He wasn't going to take a moment to listen to his side of the story. Instead, George was clinging to a narrative, a stereotype that had no real foundation, except for a vague report that could have come from anyone. The weight of the accusation hung in the air like a heavy cloud. "Wait, what? Are you seriously telling me you're arresting me based on a vague tip from an anonymous caller?" Michael said, his voice trembling with both disbelief and frustration. George didn't meet his gaze. His eyes were locked onto his radio, tapping away once again as if the whole situation was a formality he was simply going through. "It's procedure. We don't take chances. You look like the guy in the description, and there've been incidents around here. So, yeah, I'm doing my job." Michael's jaw clenched, the blood boiling beneath his skin. He could feel the rush of emotions, but he knew he couldn't lose control. Not now. Not when his identity and career were on the line. "That's ridiculous," Michael retorted. "I am a FBI agent. You can verify everything. But you'd rather hold on to your prejudices and your assumptions than do your job properly." The officer glanced at him coldly, and it was then Michael understood. George wasn't about to listen to reason. He had already decided who Michael was, based on nothing more than the color of his skin. Michael could see it in the officer's eyes, the way he wasn't even willing to look deeper. "Step aside," George barked, his voice growing more hostile. "You're not helping yourself." "I don't have time for your games," George muttered, pulling out a piece of paper from his pocket, still unwilling to listen to the truth, his hands shaking slightly with the stress of his own actions. Michael could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Call my bureau," he said again, quieter now. "Call someone. Please." But George shook his head, his face grim, as if Michael's plea was an inconvenience. "I don't need to do that. I know what I saw." At that moment, Michael realized the painful truth. The officer wasn't just blind to the facts. He was willfully ignoring them. And it wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. George's refusal to listen, to investigate, to question his assumptions. It was all built on years of prejudice and stereotypes. And Michael, standing there in cuffs, realized the road ahead was going to be much harder than he'd ever imagined. George's grip tightened around Michael's arm, his fingers digging into his skin as he forcefully shoved him toward the police car. The cold metal of the vehicle greeted Michael with a harsh, mechanical clank as the officer slammed the door shut. The pain from the tight cuffs around his wrists surged again, but Michael remained calm, his breath steady despite the storm of injustice unfolding before him. "You have the right to remain silent," George spat, his voice low and filled with hostility. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Michael's mind raced, still reeling from the absurdity of the situation. How had it come to this? He was a dedicated FBI agent, and now he was being treated like a criminal, dragged through the streets with no regard for the truth. The drive to the station was a blur. The tension in the car was palpable. Michael could feel the officer's eyes boring into the back of his head, judging him, doubting him, as if Michael's very existence was a crime. When they arrived at the station, George pulled Michael out of the car with a force that made him stumble slightly. Michael's body protested, but he steadied himself. It didn't matter how rough they treated him now. What mattered was that he knew the truth, and he would make sure they saw it too. George yanked him forward, dragging him like a common criminal across the parking lot. The harsh glare of the fluorescent lights above cast long, haunting shadows as they approached the entrance. Michael could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, but none of them stepped forward to question George. None of them challenged the narrative being forced upon him. As they reached the station's main entrance, the police chief emerged from his office. The man's gaze fell immediately on Michael, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The chief's steps faltered, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Michael." The chief's voice carried a note of surprise, and Michael turned slowly to meet his gaze. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to quiet. It was as if the entire station had frozen in place. "Chief Williams." Michael's voice was laced with both relief and confusion. What was he doing here? The police chief's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, and his eyes softened. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice heavy with authority but also a glimmer of concern. He turned to George, whose stance had suddenly shifted, from defensive to uncertain, now realizing the identity of the man he had been treating like a criminal. "What is this?" The chief's voice boomed through the tense atmosphere. "Why is Michael in handcuffs? And why the hell is he being treated like a criminal?" George's mouth opened and closed, unsure how to respond. His earlier confidence was crumbling under the weight of the police chief's scrutiny. Finally he spoke, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "I got a call from someone in the vicinity. They said they saw a man who looked suspicious, fitting the description of someone who'd been involved in a robbery here last week," George explained, his words rushed. "I had to detain him. I also believe he's lying. Impersonating an FBI agent, sir." Michael's heart sank. He could see George trying to justify his actions, twisting the situation to protect his own reputation. The irony was almost unbearable. He, an actual FBI agent, being accused of impersonating one. The chief's eyes widened with disbelief, then slowly narrowed as he turned his gaze back to Michael. He took a step toward him, his voice softening immediately. "Michael, I am so sorry for this. I had no idea. This shouldn't have happened." But before the apology could go any further, George cut in, his tone sharp and defensive. "With all due respect, sir, he is accused of alleged robbery. We have to follow protocol. The arrest was necessary." The room fell silent. It was as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of the accusation. But then, with a deep breath, the police chief's voice rose, cutting through the tension like a whip. "Will you shut up?" Chief Williams' words rang out, sharp and authoritative, silencing George with a single command. The force of his words stunned everyone in the room, especially George, who stood frozen, blinking in confusion. Michael could see the chief's anger bubbling over. This was not just about an arrest. This was about the abuse of power, the failure to see the truth, the dismissal of the dignity of a man simply because of his skin color. Chief Williams turned back to Michael, his expression softening again. "I'm sorry for everything that's happened. But George," the chief's voice hardened as he turned to face the officer, "you have no idea who you've just arrested." George's confusion was evident, but the police chief wasn't waiting for an explanation. He raised his voice, steady and commanding. Michael Davis is not just any man. He's a high-ranking officer in the FBI. He's a damn agent of the law. He works for this country. And you've just treated him like a criminal. You've humiliated him. Do you understand the consequences of your actions? George's face turned a shade of white that Michael had never seen before. The shift in color was instant. Panic, realization, guilt, and it was clear to everyone in the room that the officer had no idea who he was dealing with. George stood there for a moment, frozen, as the weight of his mistake settled on him like a 1,000-pound burden. Michael watched him, a mixture of disbelief and a quiet satisfaction curling in his chest. "Michael, I am so sorry," George muttered, his voice barely audible now. "I didn't know." His gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time, Michael could see the officer truly understand the gravity of his mistake. The police chief didn't soften his stance, though. "You better start understanding, and you better start learning to think before you act. This isn't a game. You don't just detain people because of their appearance, because of some random call. You don't treat people like this without consequences." Michael stood tall, his hands still bound by the cold metal cuffs, yet his gaze was unyielding. The apology that George had offered him, torn and half-hearted as it was, had barely grazed the surface of the pain Michael felt. Words, no matter how sincere, would never be enough. Not after what had happened. Not after the humiliation. Not after the systemic rot that allowed an innocent man, a fellow officer, to be treated as a criminal just because of the color of his skin. He straightened his posture, forcing himself to look George in the eyes, even though the officer's face was as pale as a ghost. But Michael's focus wasn't on George anymore. His words, when they came, were directed at the police chief. "Apologies aren't enough," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. His words cut through the tense air, echoing in the room. "This isn't just about me. It's about the system you all operate under. Is this how you police? By racially discriminating against people based on their appearance? Is this how you protect and serve?" The chief shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowing. But Michael was undeterred. He continued, his voice rising in both volume and intensity. "Where's the justice in this? Where is the accountability when someone like George can act on his own biases and violate a man's rights, without so much as a second thought? You talk about good policing, but where is it when the system itself is broken? When the law, the very thing you claim to uphold, is used as a weapon against the innocent? This isn't just a personal failure. It's a failure of the system. A system that needs to be addressed and overhauled." Michael's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his frustration, his pain, and his anger. The room went silent. George stood off to the side, looking like a child caught doing something wrong. His face remained ashen, his gaze never meeting Michael's. The police chief, to his credit, didn't shrink away from the confrontation. He met Michael's gaze squarely, his expression a mix of regret and something deeper, and that is a shame. The chief took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he folded his arms. "You're right," Chief Williams finally said, his voice low but resolute. "Apologies are not enough. I understand that now. And I'm not going to brush this under the rug. George will be sanctioned, and there will be an investigation into this entire matter. This situation will be handled fairly, and the right steps will be taken." Michael gave a single, curt nod. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was a start. The system, for all its flaws, had at least been forced to confront its own shortcomings in that moment. Michael wasn't naive enough to believe that one conversation, one apology, would bring about the change he knew was necessary. But the fact that the police chief, despite his earlier misjudgment, was willing to listen, willing to acknowledge the problem, meant something. "You can't just apologize and move on," Michael continued, his tone a bit softer now. "The system needs to change. The way you train your officers, the way you approach people, especially those who look like me, needs to be examined. Because as long as people like George continue to act on their biases, more innocent lives will be ruined." Chief Williams took a long pause, the weight of Michael's words settling in. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I'll do what I can. We'll address it properly. Michael glanced over at George, who still stood silent, his hands at his sides. He was no longer the cocky officer who had thought himself above reproach. Now, he was just a man who had been caught in his own ignorance, forced to confront the damage his actions had caused. I hope you mean it, Michael said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of caution. Because if you don't, then this is just another one of those empty promises that never change anything. The chief gave a solemn nod. I do. This won't be ignored. And George, he turned to face the officer, his voice cold and cutting, you will learn what it truly means to serve the people the right way. George, still reeling from the realization of what he had done, opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He simply nodded in acknowledgement, his face a mask of regret. Michael's heart felt a little lighter, but only a little. The truth had been revealed, and justice, in the form of an apology and a promise of action, had been given. But Michael knew this was only the beginning. He wasn't just going to let the system slip back into complacency. This wasn't a personal battle. It was a societal one. And as long as he had a voice, he would continue to fight for what was right. You can take the cuffs off now, Michael said finally, his tone growing firm again, though tinged with resignation. I think we're done here. Chief Williams didn't hesitate. He nodded to an officer nearby, who quickly moved to release Michael's handcuffs. The cold metal fell away, and Michael flexed his wrists, feeling the slight sting of the skin rubbing back to normal. He didn't need to be handcuffed anymore. The truth had already been set free. As he walked past George, Michael gave him one last look. George, who had once stood so confident, now stood broken, defeated by his own ignorance. Michael said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He turned to the police chief, who had now softened somewhat, his expression somber but sincere. I'll be watching, Michael said quietly. This needs to be addressed. For real. With that, he turned and walked out of the station, the weight of the world still on his shoulders, but a small spark of hope burning bright in his chest. For change to happen, someone had to stand up. And Michael had done just that. As Michael stepped out of the police station, the warm Atlanta sun hit his face, a subtle reminder that life was moving forward, whether the world was ready for it or not. The incident that had unfolded was far from over. There would be investigations, consequences, and likely more uncomfortable truths to face. But as he took that first step into the world beyond the station, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, because sometimes, just standing up and speaking the truth was enough to begin the healing process. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't about the injustice he had faced or the unfair treatment he had endured. This was about something bigger, a larger systemic issue that needed to be addressed, not with silence or avoidance, but with real change. He knew this wasn't the end. There would always be more battles to fight. But what mattered now was that the conversation had begun. The scales had tipped in the right direction, and it was up to everyone, from the highest officer to the average citizen, to carry the weight of this change forward. As Michael walked toward his car, he caught a glimpse of the police chief talking to George, his words firm but calm. He had promised to hold George accountable. He had promised to start addressing the flaws in the system. And Michael had made sure that the promise wasn't empty.